I'm Betsy.
And I'm Bree.
Today we're going to be talking about how to interpret word problems.
And today we're going to specifically focus on how to interpret word problems into linear equations.
The local bowling alley has two payment options. For each person, the bowling alley charges $2 per game or $4 per hour to rent a lane, and shoe rental is $3. You know that it takes one person about 15 minutes to bowl one game alone. If you and three friends bowl 4 games, which payment option would be cheapest?
When evaluating a word problem, the first thing you should ask yourself is, what is the problem asking us to find? And in this case, the problem is asking us to find which payment method is cheaper. It's not actually asking us to find the cost of playing 4 games with 3 other people. It's actually just asking us to find the cheaper method.
Since you only need to find the cheaper method and you don't actually have to find the total price, the next thing you'll have to do is to find what information is irrelevant in the problem. And in this case, it would be the $3 for the shoe rental, because you're going to have to rent shoes either way you go, whether you pay per hour or per game. And since that's a constant, then we don't really need to worry about it.
And then the third thing you have to ask yourself is, what should we do to solve the problem? Since we already know what information we don't need and we already know what the problem is asking us, we know that we can now create functions from the information that the problem gives us. And we know that we can create 2 functions because we have 2 different payment methods. One is the charge based on the number of games, whereas the other function is the charge based on the number of hours it takes to play those games.
In order to make these 2 functions, what we need to do is create variables. So our first variable, we will use C for the charge, which would be the charge, how much we're paying. The next one, we're going to use H for the number of hours, and we'll use G for the number of games, and then P for the number of people.
And then the last thing you do before you actually solve the problem is set up equations. In this case, the equations we've already talked about are the 2 functions. The first equation, the one based on the number of games, will equal C, since C is the charge, equals 2 times G, which is the number of games. And that was a pretty simple one to figure out. But the other function that we have is actually a little bit more difficult to interpret. The other function that we have to interpret is C is equal to 4 times H, where $4 is the charge it takes to rent a lane per hour, and H is the number of hours that we're playing. Before we actually set up the second equation, we have to figure out how much time it's going to take for you and your 3 friends to bowl 4 games. So based on the information that the word problem gives us, we know that it takes 15 minutes for a single person to play a single game by themselves. So based on that, we know that we have 4 people playing and we want to play 4 games. So it'll be 15 minutes times 4 people times 4 games, which will be the amount of hours we have. But if you actually want to change the number of people and the number of games, the equation we have set up is H is equal to 0.25 times P times G, where 0.25 is 15 minutes out of 60 minutes, which is an hour. P is the number of people playing, and G is the number of games those people want to play. So H is equal to 0.25 times P times G. So now we can actually set up the second equation now that we know what the variable for H stands for. We know that C is going to equal 4 times H, but now that we actually have an equation for H, we can plug in that equation into our function. C will now equal 4 times 0.25 times P times G. And now, you're solving the problem.
So in solving our first equation with the charge per game per person, we have C equals $2 times how many games? And since we want to play 4 games, we'll do $2 times the 4 games to give us $8. So we'll be paying $8 per person. For the second equation, the charge per hour, we have the charge equals $4 times 0.25 hours times how many people times how many games. So we'll have the 4 times 0.25, and we have 4 people and 4 games. So we'll sub those in for P and G. And $4 times 0.25 hours would be $1, and then 4 times 4, the games times the people, is 16. So that would be $16. But in order to see how much we would be paying per person, we would have to divide by 4, because we had to factor in how long we would be renting the lane. So we're going to divide by 4 because we have 4 people, and 16 divided by 4 gives us $4 per person. Therefore, the cheaper payment method would be the charge per hour because we're only paying $4, whereas when we pay per game, we would be paying $8.
Oh, I'm Betsy. And I'm Bree. Today we're going to be talking about how to interpret.
But for the second equation, before we can actually set up the second equation now that we know what the variable for h stands for. We know that c is going to equal 4 times h into our function. C will now equal 4 times 0.25 times p times g. And we can actually simplify that on